our best to follow this up. So for our last session then, we have Professor Phil Newton, who is a professor. Hopefully, Phil, you're there.
I'm here.
Excellent. So Phil, I don't know, you probably, I don't know if you were listening to us as an accounting group. I hope you weren't despairing. But anyway, you're a professor of medicine at Swansea University, so you're a colleague of Sarah's. You're the director of teaching and learning for the Swansea University Medical School, so a completely different area, but this is where we can actually take lessons from other areas and integrate them into our own area. So you teach a number of neuroscience, you teach neuroscience across a variety of programs in your school, and you also teach on evidence-based education as part of an MSc in medical education. I note here that you have a number of qualifications. You got a BSc in biology at Aberystwyth. You have an MSc in medical education from Cardiff, and you also have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Leeds. And prior to working in Swansea, you were at the University of California in San Francisco. How lovely that must have been. If you look at Phil's profile, you'll see that Phil has done a whole range of publications and outputs, anything from looking at the student experience during COVID to widening access, to what else have we got here, enhancing learning, lots of different things. So Phil, I think without further ado, I think I'll hand over to you. So about maybe, well, 30 minutes, or sorry, not 30 minutes, but well, about that there, or sorry, you've got an hour and a half in total. So Phil, it's up to you how you decide to run the session. If you want, you maybe ask people to do various things along the way and engage with people, or ask for comments. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Joan. And in the interest of being technically accurate, I should say I'm no longer the Director of Learning and Teaching for the medical school, but the fact that it still says that on the website, I think is symptomatic of how we're going to deal with the challenges, or not, of ChatGPT. If we can't even get the website updated, the chances of us updating all our policies are limited. And I have been here during the conversation. I should also make that clear as well. I've been furiously updating my slides because it's actually been really, really helpful to get a sense of what the mood is for the folks who are here, and the dominant themes and some questions that people have. And that's really actually helped me tailor the presentation we're about to do to hopefully try and address some of those, or at least as best we can. It does mean that I've been updating my slides in real time up until about 90 seconds ago, though. So we'll see how well that goes. So what we will do, we will leave some time at the end to have a go at some of the things that I'm going to propose, and whether we get to that or not, I suspect is up to you all, really. Let's just share my screen and ask you to confirm A, that you can see the slides, and B, that it's the slides and not the notes pages that you can see.
That's correct. Yep.
All right. So hello, and thanks for that introduction, Joan. I guess I'm here in part because I have done a lot of work on academic integrity, but we're going to do something slightly different. We are going to talk a bit about academic integrity, but I am going to get you to do a couple of things. So you will need something to write with at some point, be that an old-fashioned pen or a paper, or a tablet, or even just your phone. We're not going to do anything complicated. I'm not going to get you to do any accountancy or any neuroscience. We're just going to do a couple of exercises which will help me illustrate what I hope are some useful principles for us to take away. John's already given me an introduction, and I'm not going to expand on that in great detail, except to reinforce, I guess, the idea that I'm here, or when I was first invited by Joan and Sarah, it was in part because I'd done a lot of work on contract cheating, and in more recent times, a lot of work on assessment. And this was in the autumn of last year, in an era that we might call pre-GPT, when life was very different. And so the original menu for today was going to be some talk about cheating in online exams and how common it is. And then we were going to talk about higher order learning And then we're going to link those two things together by talking about how to assess higher order learning using multiple choice questions. We should hopefully tackle some of the workload and other questions that have come up during your discussion. The punchline of that was that, and it still is, that we can assess higher order learning with multiple choice questions. And in the pre-ChatGPT era, myself and a project student, we did some experiments that I was really proud of and am still really proud of, which showed that if we used multiple choice questions that were framed in a way that assessed higher order learning, that would make it harder for students to cheat. And I was going to triumphantly propose this as a way of dealing with some of the challenges of contract cheating. And also as a way of making our assessments more authentic, because it meant we could do open book online exams using this format. But then along came ChatGPT and smashed my itinerary to pieces. The original ChatGPT punched a great big hole in it, but then we chased it around for a while and we tweaked our guidance and our approach and did some more research. And then ChatGPT, based upon GPT-4, came along and smashed it to pieces again. And so I've spent a few months now chasing ChatGPT around, and ChatGPT has defeated me. The most recent attempt to try and defeat it led me to a fairly miserable training journey on the way back home from a conference where I'd been delivered yet one more blow by GPT-4. And I realized that the strategy I was thinking of using wasn't going to work, and that chasing GPT-4 and ChatGPT and the other tools around wasn't going to work, and trying to beat it wasn't going to work. Certainly, as we've seen in the earlier presentations, trying to ban it, I don't think is going to work. And at the time, this was March 14th, just 6 short weeks ago, I didn't know what we were going to do. And so to try and cheer myself up, I asked one of these AI tools to make a picture of a professor sitting on a train experiencing an existential crisis, because that was me. I had to give a webinar in 2 weeks to Ireland's QA version of the QAA QQI, and I didn't have a clue what I was going to say. As an interesting aside, I asked for 10 different versions of this picture, and in every single one of them, the professor was a middle-aged white male, which is yet another one of the challenges that we're going to have to work with, I think. So we've bounced back, we're cheerful, we're optimistic, we've had some lunch. So what we are going to talk about today then is we are going to talk about cheating in online exams, because it is still very important, and the data that we collected last summer, I think, are still very relevant, in fact, more relevant than ever. And then we're going to pivot, and we're going to talk a little bit about some very basics about the neuroscience and the cognitive psychology of how we learn. And in particular, what we're going to talk about is what higher order learning is and what it is not, and why the distinction between those two things are important. We'll talk a little bit about the assessment of higher order learning, and sprinkled throughout that, obviously, is going to be the flavor of the moment, ChatGPT. Then in the second half, we'll talk a bit about how to write effective multiple choice questions, and we'll talk about that in general, and then we'll talk about how to write multiple choice questions that assess higher order learning. And then as part of that, I'll try and hopefully persuade you why I think that this is an important part of addressing some of the challenges posed by a variety of different challenges that we face to the security and integrity of assessments in general, including to online exams, but also the challenges that we face from plagiarism, from contract cheating, and now ChatGPT when it comes to more traditional assessments of higher order learning, like essays and other written forms of coursework. Okay, so let's go on to the first of these then. So you remember COVID, the last crisis that we faced, a very, very serious situation for us all, and we were all forced to pivot our learning and teaching and assessment into a form that worked online. And we all, I think those of us involved in those discussions about how to do that in 2020 and 2021, we all told ourselves that higher education was never going to be the same again, and that we had to capture all of the things that we had learned about how to learn and to teach and to assess and to support students online, because there's a huge amount to be gained from delivering some of our learning online, particularly opening up higher education to students who might not be able to drop everything and come on campus, for example. And so when we started to come back to learning, teaching and assessment in person, there was a discussion about whether or not we should be keeping online assessments, and in particular online exams. And there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not that was a good idea. But one of the main concerns that was repeatedly expressed about the challenges of keeping online exams is that students were cheating, and they were cheating in significant numbers. And so one of the things we did last summer was a systematic review to try and work out whether or not that was actually the case. We did a review of the literature on cheating in online exams to try and work out how common it is and whether or not it did in fact go up during the lockdown learning associated with COVID-19. So this is myself and project student Kearney Essex, now one of our medical students. And we didn't collect any primary data ourselves. We simply did a systematic review of the literature. And there's a huge amount of literature generated in the field of academic integrity, which is asking students, have you ever done this particular thing? Copied an essay, bought an essay, cheated in an online exam, etc., etc. And we just brought all of that literature together. We focused our review on research from summative exams only, so not formative assessments or quizzes. And we didn't specify the format. We didn't look at whether the exams were essay-based or multiple choice-based. It was just that they were online and they were summative, so they carried some form of credit. We collected studies across various different disciplines. And as I alluded to earlier, they were almost all self-report studies because there's very few other ways to measure academic misconduct other than asking students if they've ever done it. We collected studies going back about 10 years, and we ended up with 27 different data sets from 19 different papers from a whole range of different countries, although the dominant country of origin of the research was the United States. And there were over 5,000 different participants combined across these different studies. And so basically all we did, or the first metric that we made was we took all of these 5,278 participants who'd all been asked some version of a question, have you ever cheated in an online exam? And the first thing we did was calculate what percentage of them said yes. And why don't you tell me in the chat, or tell us all in the chat, what percentage of those students do you think admitted at some point to having cheated in an online exam? Is anyone willing to venture a guess? Okay. And we've got a range of different options, many of which are reflective of cynicism's the wrong word. Pragmatism and realism may be the most more appropriate, ranging from 25 to from 15, I should say, to 92. It's a very precise number, Sarah. The first time I presented these data, there was a student representative in the room. This was at a Council of Europe meeting, and she put her hand up and said 100%. You know, why wouldn't they? Which I was not prepared for. The answer was 44.7%. And I was really surprised by this. I was in the same boat as Paul and Funby and others, where I thought we were going to be looking at about 10 to 15%. But I was really surprised to see that it was so very many students that were willing to admit to having cheated in a summative assessment in an online exam. Now, this isn't the whole story, though. If we split, so we've got 27 different samples. If we split those up into the ones that were conducted before COVID and the ones that were conducted during COVID, then you can see a very big split. Okay, so the studies that were conducted before COVID, it is in about the same figure about the ballpark that Paul was alluding to. It's about 25, 27%. The studies that were conducted during COVID, that number more than doubles. And one way of looking at this is that more students were willing to admit that they had cheated than had not cheated. So more students cheating than not. So huge amounts of students willing to admit that they had cheated during COVID. There are lots of other differences between those two data sets. It's, correlation is not causation, but on balance, it seems likely that cheating did indeed increase significantly during COVID. A couple of other things which I think are really important about the data that we collected. Lots of students were asked in these studies, how were you cheating? And the dominant answer was that students were reported cheating on their own. I think the most important message that I wanted to get across, which I alluded to in a question on an earlier presentation, is that students were asked, why did you cheat? And a simple summary of why they cheated was because they could. And if you think about the situation, particularly during COVID, they were put in a situation where they were doing an online assessment, and their university had not taken particular steps to prevent them cheating. So they were told, look, don't cheat, don't talk to each other, don't look up stuff online. But there was no measures put in place to stop them doing that. And that set off a couple of thought processes for them. The first was that they thought, well, it tells me what my university thinks about how important it is for me not to cheat, because they're not stopping me doing it. And then also the thought process was triggered, well, if it's so easy for me to cheat, well, then it's really easy for everybody else to cheat. And so I'd be a fool not to. And I think this was another point that was made during the discussion that preceded this presentation, that if students are seeing that everyone else is cheating, then they think, well, it's a competitive environment. They're all going to come out with a better mark than me, so I should. As an aside, probably a discussion for another day, lots of these studies lacked a certain amount of rigor, and that's no criticism of the authors of those studies. It's the way that we tend to do things in the field of academic integrity. We don't have a lot of resource to dedicate to doing this sort of research, so we use convenient samples with a low response rate. But the chances are that if we'd done those studies a little more rigorously, we'd have found an even higher percentage. So I'm just checking on the comments. So one thing that's comes up a lot when I present these data is some concern about the use of the word cheating, and a concern that presenting the data in this way is portraying students as cheats, and that, you know, an assumption that given the opportunity, even half an opportunity, the students are all just looking for the chance to cheat and to not do the work. And I think this situation is perhaps more complicated than simply one or the other. And the way that I'm going to illustrate that is with a picture of this magnificent creature. We like to think of, and we often think about these discussions, these questions and issues in terms of higher education. We think about students, we think about cheating, we think about their behavior. But of course, students are human beings, and all human beings are presented with the opportunity to cheat in one way or another on an almost daily basis. And the example that I'm going to use to try and illustrate the point comes from the literature around speeding when driving, speeding on motorways, speeding on dual carriageways, speeding in vehicles, and so on. And there is a long-standing literature around whether or not people speed, the factors that cause them to speed, and there is a phenomenon within that literature that's called the kangaroo effect, which is my excuse for showing you the picture of this magnificent kangaroo. And the kangaroo effect in the literature on speeding refers to the behavior of human drivers in the presence of a speeding camera. And hopefully you all know what a speeding camera is. When we put a fixed stationary speeding camera on a road, then people behave, according to the literature on this phenomenon, like kangaroos. They hop from one side of the speeding camera to the other. And here is a graphic from a study of taxi drivers in Korea showing the speed of these various example taxis around a speed camera placed upon a main road. So you can see in the center of the image there, a speeding camera, and you can see a color-coded image that shows the speed of these two particular taxis before, around, and after the speed camera. And you can see that just like about 50% of drivers on average, they are speeding before the camera, they slow down when the camera is present, and they speed up again afterwards. So students are just people the same as the rest of us, and the easier it is for people to cheat, the more likely they are to cheat. That doesn't mean they're fundamentally bad people, that they're all dishonest, that we're all looking for opportunities to cheat. It's a simple pragmatic presentation of human behavior, that the easier it is for us to cheat, the more likely we are to. And the UK government's own data show that on any given day on a motorway, when the traffic is moving freely, about half the drivers are driving in excess of the speed limit. Okay. So students cheating in online exams, in part because they can. What do we do about that? Now, We did do an additional project, which I'm not going to have time to talk about in great detail, but which I'm just going to link to very briefly, about the effectiveness of remote proctoring or remote invigilation, basically using some sort of webcam monitoring system, often linked into some AI type software that monitors students' behavior, and then flags up when they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, either flagged up by a human who's watching them at the other end or flagged up by some remote monitoring software. That does seem to reduce cheating, in part just because students know that they're being watched, but students absolutely hate it. And we did a review of the student experience of remote proctoring, and the horror stories that were contained in that were absolutely astonishing about students who would rather wear adult nappies and urinate on themselves than get up and leave their exam to go to the toilet because they would be so worried about doing that in an incorrect way and being flagged up and accused of cheating. And clearly that's not a situation that we want to be in. So we need to think about doing something slightly differently. It's not slightly differently, very differently, I think. So there are lots of other things that we can do with online exams to try and promote academic integrity. And I'm just going to summarize the literature that we found on that. Using question banks is an oft-cited way of promoting the integrity of online exams. So you've got a bunch of students, they're all going to take 50 questions in an online exam, you use a bank of 200, and so the students get slightly different question diets from that bank. That means that not all students are answering all the same questions, but it does mean then that it's harder for them to share answers. Even though students hate it, there is a place, we think, for remote proctoring. Even when in the studies we reviewed where students said that they hated it, they recognized the need for it, and they were in some ways grateful that the university was taking the situation seriously and putting in these sorts of situations. At the very least, a remote proctoring system can positively identify the person sitting at the other end of the camera. Only using one question at a time and not letting students backtrack makes it harder for students to share answers with each other. And then randomizing the order of questions and then randomizing the order of answer options also makes it harder for students to cheat. And then setting a time limit makes it more difficult still. Not a punitive time limit, but not giving students 36 hours, for example, to do an exam, which really only needs about 90 minutes. So these were all recommendations that we made about how to prevent group cheating in online exams. And as I alluded to earlier, we had thought we had come up with ways of stopping students being able to simply go online and answer exam questions. But that's where ChatGPT came in. The challenge with ChatGPT is, whether we like it or not, it makes cheating very, very, very easy. And despite what some of my colleagues may have suggested, the current evidence, particularly around GPT-4, is that it makes it very, very effective as well. There is an abundance of literature out there. We've seen some examples already today about the types of things that ChatGPT can do. And I'm going to emphasize here the latest version of ChatGPT can write essays to a very high standard, and it can reference those essays, as can Bard and some of the other tools as well. ChatGPT of any standard can solve complex problems. GPT-4 can do that better than others. I'll show you some examples of these in a second, using multiple choice or short answer. Some of you may have seen a news story on a paper by Debbie Cotton and colleagues down in Plymouth, John, that showed ChatGPT writing academic papers, synthesizing literature, making recommendations, referencing it, and so on. ChatGPT can write code. GPT-4, I should say, can write code, and it can use it to build websites, and it can do that on the basis of very simple prompts. And there are very many other things that these tools can do besides. And again, as a point that's been repeatedly made, GPT-4 and ChatGPT are just one of very many tools that are being developed. I'm going to say this now because I think I might forget to say it later on, that another issue which we must not lose sight of is that these tools are, we currently think of ChatGPT as something that we log into and we put information in and we get information out. These tools are already part of search engines like Bing, and they are going to be, if they are not already, part of things like Microsoft Word and the other word processing and data analysis tools that we give our students to use to complete their assignments. So banning access to them is going to be impossible, and even students knowing whether or not they're using them is going to be really difficult, because they're going to be, if they are not already, part of everyday life. So I'm going to show you an example of a problem that GPT-4 can solve. Now, one of the other things that I do in my day job is we run workshops about how to give effective presentations. And one of the things we say over and over again in these presentations is don't put loads of text on a screen and expect people to read it. However, I'm about to put loads of text on the screen. Now, I'm not expecting you to read it, but the reason I've decided to stick with it is because there's a lot of text that I'm going to show you that's part of this problem, and it's really complicated. And you don't have to read it all. I will summarize for you what it is, but I don't want to over summarize it and give you the idea that ChatGPT is solving a simple problem. The problem that it's solving is this one. All right, now this is a scenario from the USMLE. The USMLE is the United States Medical Licensing Exam. It's the exam that medical students have to pass at a high level if they want to become doctors in the United States. This scenario describes a 6-year-old boy who's got scurvy. Right, now, scurvy is a disease that was very common many years ago, and in certain areas where nutrition is poor, is still reasonably common, and obviously there is exacerbated in situations like where there's high levels of poverty, because it's caused by not having enough vitamin C in the diet. So this scenario describes a 6-year-old boy who's got scurvy. It doesn't say scurvy, it doesn't say vitamin C, it doesn't say diet. It just gives a description of what how the boy presents, which is the language we would use in medicine. So he's brought in to see the doctor, and he's got certain characteristics, and is then examined by the doctor. And then the question that's asked is, you, the medical student answering this question, should ask for more information, so an additional history regarding what thing? What do you need to know about this boy in order to work out what to do best for this boy? So it's most appropriate to obtain a specific additional history regarding which of the following. And this question then gives 5 options. Do you need to know more about diet? Do you need to know more about pica, which is putting inappropriate things in your mouth, whether they're using herbal supplementations in the diet, lead exposure, self-injury? Which of those 5 do you need to know? You feed this into ChatGPT or GPT-4, and it gets it right, and it gives, without prompting, a fantastic explanation as to why the correct answer is the correct answer, based upon the biology of vitamin C. So it says diet, it knows it's diet, it knows also that it's vitamin C that's deficient in the diet, and gives an explanation as to why. This is just one example, and I will come back to it. It's obviously an example from medicine, but there are examples of GPT-4 solving problems like this in many, many, many different disciplines. So myself and a project student, Myra Ziramariti, we have looked at a whole range of different formal exams in higher education to see how well ChatGPT does at those. And we've looked at, let me change the pointer so I can illustrate this better. Old ChatGPT 3.5 and below, GPT-4, and MCQ exams from medicine, from law, from accounting, from physics, from chemistry, etc. And the punchline is that old ChatGPT does pretty well, gets an average of about 50%. GPT-4 does about 25 percentage points better on average. And when you compare the performance of those 2 tools to the pass mark for those exams, old GPT does well, but it fails most of the time. GPT-4 passes most of the time. Doesn't pass by a lot, but in many cases, the pass mark is at 60, 70, 80% anyway, so there's not a lot of room for it to do better, but it passes. So it does really, really well. And again, just to re-emphasize this point, lots of the initial media hyperbole and a lot of the academic research was based upon GPT-3 and variations of it. GPT-4 is way better, and it's way better at pretty much all the things that we thought the original ChatGPT was good at, but in particular, it's much, much better at solving MCQ exams. And myself and Joan and Sarah doing a project based upon some formal exams in accountancy, and I won't give you the punchline of that just yet. I'll leave that to them. But it's not a million miles away from this pattern that we're seeing here. So what do we do other than sit on a train and experience an existential crisis and despair and or panic? One of the things that we see quite frequently is this idea that if ChatGPT can pass your assessments, then you're setting the wrong assessments. And then we should just scrap exams. We should just scrap tests because students are going to be using ChatGPT and other tools in the real world. And so we need to prepare students to use those tools in the real world, and giving them multiple choice questions with factual examples is just wasting everybody's time because it's not authentic, and they won't need to do this anyway because ChatGPT can do it for them. Now, there is some validity to this, and it certainly is intuitively sensible. It appears an obvious thing to do, and it's no different to how people have responded to things like Google. Why do we want students to learn facts when they can just Google it? Is something we used to hear a lot in the pre-ChatGPT era. And what I'm going to do now is hopefully try and persuade you of the fundamental importance of facts, and the fact that you can't critically appraise something that you don't know the basic facts about. And rather than me just say this, we're going to do a very basic exercise to try and illustrate some fundamental principles from the science of how we learn, and then map that on to the basic principle that I just mentioned about facts. So what we're going to do, as I said, is a couple of very short exercises, very short. In order to do those, you need a pen and paper or something to write. So this is where it comes from. Now, not occasionally, every time we do these exercises, people get a little bit tense and they think that they're going to be tested, or they scowl at me down the Zoom. It's just going to be a quiz. It could be 2 quizzes, actually. All right, very simple. And I'm going to ask you to tell me how well you did, but I'm going to tell you now that in at least one of them, you're probably not going to do very well. And that's okay, because it illustrates the point. And if you don't want to share your answers, that's absolutely fine. We can use some generic data because we've done this a lot. So the first thing we're going to do then is I'm going to show you a list of words. Okay, and those list of words is going to display for 8 seconds. And what I want you to do is just look at it. Don't write anything down. Don't take any pictures. Just look at it and try and remember it. Okay, so it's a list of words. I just want you to try and remember the words that are on the list. After those 8 seconds are up, there's going to be a blank slide for 5 seconds. And all I want you to do in that 5 seconds is nothing except try and remember what was on the previous slides. To try and remember the list of words. So don't write anything yet. Just for those 5 seconds, try and hold on to the memory of that list of words from that slide. And then I want you to write them down. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me how many you got. Actually, I'm not. We're going to do this different exercise. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me how many you got. All right. Does that make sense? I can see a couple of you frowning at me down the Zoom. All right. List of words, 8 seconds. Try and remember them. 5 seconds. Still try and remember them. Then write them down. All right. Here we go. Hold on to it for just 5 seconds. And then write them down. And normally, if we were in person, I'd be looking around the room and see when everyone had finished. I can see people they're looking nervously at the screen. A couple are still writing, so I'll give them a couple of seconds. All right. Okay, it's just a quiz. All right. Now, what we're going to do before I show you the answers is we're going to do exactly the same thing again. All right, list of words, 8 seconds, try and remember them, blank slide for 5 seconds, try and remember them. And once the 5 seconds are up, then write them down. And then I'll show you both the lists and I'll tell you why it's important. Okay, here we go, second list. And hold on to that feeling, because that feeling is important and we'll come back to it a bit later. All right, 5 seconds. And then write them down. This bit doesn't normally take as long. Well, it's stopped already. One day we'll have somebody from Myanmar and I'll have to give them extra time. Okay, so what you saw on those two lists was the 10 biggest towns and cities in the UK and the 10 biggest towns and cities in Myanmar. And the reason I've picked those two countries is because they are something like 12th and 13th in terms of the countries with the biggest population. So they're very similar in terms of their population size. Let's start with the list from Myanmar. If you're willing and able, there's the list. Put in your answer in the chat how many you got right or how many you didn't get right. That's amazing. I wouldn't have got even one, I think. I might have got Mandalay. Okay, so it's very challenging and anxiety producing to do this sort of real-time calculation in a Zoom room full of accountants. So I'm just going to fudge and say we're at about probably 1 and a bit to 2. All right. There's the second
No,
list.
we've already just said there's no right answer, and that's what we're trying to teach our students. So you're okay.
Okay. Interesting. We will come back to that as well on the next slide. In fact, there's the second list. How many did you get right from that one? All right. And we don't need to do an unpaired t-test, I think, to show that we've clearly done better with the second one. Sorry, with the first one than we did with the second one. Done better with towns and cities in the UK. Now, it seems like a trivial exercise, and it is a trivial exercise because in order for me to demonstrate this with something a higher level would take up far more time than we've got. But this still illustrates the same point. The list of towns and cities in the UK, hopefully, there's almost no one in the audience here who doesn't know what any of these are. So if I ask you, what is Liverpool or Brighton or Leicester or Coventry, you would be able to tell me what it is. You'd probably be able to point at it on a map. If you're like me, you'd probably be able to tell me the name of the football teams that play there, how to get there on the train. You might know somebody from there, the colours that a football team plays in, who the mayor is. You'd be able to tell me all sorts of things about most of these towns and cities. You know what they are. And yet when I ask you to just hold on to this list of 10 towns and cities for 5 seconds, you can't do it. I don't think anybody got 10. Yes, they are just England. I think well, maybe one person got 10, but most of us don't. Most of us didn't get 10. Huge amount of knowledge about what these things are. Hold on to them for just 5 seconds. You can't do it. And the reason for that is because you're using 2 different types of memory to do those 2 different things. So when you think about towns and cities in England and you think about the strip that Liverpool plays in, or list football teams from London, or name the universities that are in Sheffield, you are retrieving things from your long-term memory. And your long-term memory is amazing. I'll give you some more examples of how amazing it is as we go along. When I ask you just to hold on to that list for 5 seconds, having seen it for 8 seconds, even though you know what they all are, you cannot remember them for even 5 seconds, because what you're trying to use there, more or less, is working memory. And as a pure example, When you're trying to hold on to the list of towns and cities from Myanmar, you are using almost only your working memory, because you don't know, you've never seen that list before, unless you've been to Myanmar, you've got some knowledge of it. Most of us haven't got a clue what the 10 biggest towns and cities are in Myanmar. And so we're using only our working memory. And the punchline of this exercise is that working memory is absolutely hopeless. And yet it is essential for almost anything that we want our students to learn. If we unpack that a little bit, we could talk about learning and memory for a very long time, but for the purposes of a simple exercise, there are 3 basic types of memory. The first is short-term memory, and that's basically our capacity to process sensory information. So right now, you are processing huge amounts of sensory information. You're not really even aware of it. You're processing the sensory information that the headband on my headphones is blue, that I've got a blue shirt on, that there's a tea light holder behind me, and so on. 2 minutes after this presentation has ended, you wouldn't have remembered any of that information. Once I point it out to you, though, once you pay attention to it, then it ends up in your working memory. And working memory is where information goes while we work out what to do with it. We hold information in our working memory. If we're lucky enough to do that repeatedly and to get through that working memory bottleneck, then we learn something and it goes into our long-term memory. And long-term memory is basically our storage. It's a very an example that upsets lots of neuroscientists, but it'll work for the purposes of explanation. Long-term memory is like our hard drive. We've got a huge capacity for storing information in our long-term memory, but to get it there, it's got to get through working memory, and working memory is no good. I'm going to ask you a couple of other questions. Now, don't be shy about answering these. If the answer is yes to any of them, just put an answer in the chat. The first question I want to ask is, when you were trying to write down the list of towns and cities in England, what did you do? For example, I saw some of you closing your eyes, did you picture a map of England, or did you picture the Premiership League table, or did you think about universities or Russell Group universities or something like that? Is anyone willing to venture an explanation? Yes, a map. Train stations. Okay, a fellow train nerd. EPL. Yes, okay. Interesting. Okay. And the second question, before I explain why that's important, again, don't be shy if this is the case. Has anyone got, going back to the list of towns and cities that you wrote down, anyone written down a town or city that's not on the screen in front of you? And if so, tell us what it is. Greg's got one. What have you got, Greg? Or has anyone? What have you written down? Nottingham often gets a look in, yes. Manchester United. Okay. Fantastic. It worked, even though we were on Zoom. What we do, or what I asked you to do, was to try and remember a list of towns and cities in England. And then I blanked the screen and I told you to try and hold on to that memory for 5 seconds, and then asked you to write it down. Now, you didn't actually hold on to the memory. What you did instead was you retrieved a memory based upon a cue that I had given you. And I saw that in some of the chat. Somebody said that they could tell that it was large towns and cities, and so they had just guessed what those might be on the basis of their memory. What you've done is what the cognitive psychologists would call retrieval. Okay, so you haven't really used working memory. You've seen that cue, you've seen that prompt that I've given you, and then you've tried to retrieve from your long-term memory your existing knowledge of towns and cities in England. Okay, and that retrieval is a really important part of learning, because it's what we do every time we're trying to learn something new. We make sense of something new on the basis of what we already know about it. And an illustration of how hard that is when we try and learn something about which we have absolutely no prior knowledge. So if you were trying to learn towns and cities in Myanmar, for example, it would be really, really hard because you've got almost no prior knowledge of it. We'll summarize some of these key points and then go back to a couple of other examples. And then I will eventually, I promise, get back to ChatGPT and assessment and academic integrity. Working memory is a bottleneck for learning. And yet most of the things that we want students to learn in higher education have to get through that bottleneck. The old psychology literature will say that we can hold in our working memory between 4 to 7 chunks of information. And you even saw that in the distribution of responses that you gave to the first of those little exercises that we did. When we're trying to learn something, what we do very simplistically is we match the new information, what are we trying to learn, with what we already know about it. And very basically, what working memory does is it looks into long-term memory and it says, where have we seen something that looks like this before? Where's the best place for us to stick this new information? When we do learn something, we learn it as what the psychologists would call a schema, which is a fancy way of saying that we related things are stored together. And we illustrated that by when I asked you, what did you do, and whether or not you had any towns or cities that were not on the list. So when you think, some of you pictured a map, some of you pictured train lines, some of you pictured a football league table. You've stored that information together. And then when you retrieve that information, sometimes stuff comes out that wasn't on the original list, but what it represents then is your memory of it rather than what the actual list was. So we retrieve that information, and the more we know about something, the more we are able to retrieve. And so when we talk about working memory having a capacity of only 4 to 7 chunks of information, chunk there is in inverted commas because what defines a chunk varies enormously depending upon what we already know. So if I asked you to list towns or cities in England without having given you a list, you could rattle off a massive long list of them because you know a huge amount. You wouldn't have to hold an enormous amount of information in working memory. Whereas if I asked you to do the same with towns or cities in Myanmar or in Armenia, you would find that much harder to do. A simple, very simple, simplistic, perhaps, definition of expertise is expanding the size of those schema that we hold in our long-term memory. Something that we don't have time to go into in great detail, but which I can link to a video at the end and would love to talk about some more, is that promoting this retrieval process is a very solid evidence-based way of promoting learning by our students. So getting them to take practice tests, and more importantly, getting them to write practice tests, is a very powerful, very effective, very resilient, evidence-based way of promoting learning of anything, be it facts, be it concepts, be it practical skills. Taking practice tests about it and writing tests for each other is a very powerful evidence-based way of doing that. But that's an aside for another day. All right. We're just going to do three more very, very short. I'm asking three more very, very simple questions. Now, I was going out on a limb here asking an audience from accountancy education these questions, but we're going to do it anyway, because hopefully it will still work as well as it does with non-accountants. The reason I'm going to ask you to do this is because sometimes when we do these exercises, we get some frowns around the room of people saying, look, I'm teaching students to do high-level managerial accountancy. I'm not asking them to learn lists of towns and cities. What on earth is relevance does this exercise have for my learning and teaching? And the answer for that is the model that I've shown you about how learning and memory works applies to pretty much anything that we want to learn. It's just far easier for me to demonstrate it on a Zoom call using a list of towns and cities than it is doing something much more complicated. Just in case you need a bit more persuasion, I'm going to ask you three very simple questions. All right. Now, again, I'm going to ask you, this time I'm going to ask you to answer straight away in the chat. Okay, so have your fingers poised on the chat. I'm going to show a question and I want you to put the answer in the chat as soon as you know the answer. And don't be shy or delay, because if you do, the example falls apart. And we'll see if this works as well on Zoom as it does in person. All right. First question then. As soon as you know the answer, put it in the chat. All right, flurry of 81s. Okay, let me ask you a different question. Much slower to respond, some diversity in the answer profile. And I suspect those who answered straight away perhaps didn't do quite as well as those who've taken some time. All right, whether you got it right or wrong, as I should have said again, doesn't matter. All right, and if you got it wrong, that's kind of the point. We'll do it one more time. And again, no, I didn't say this, did I? No calculators, just try and do this off the top of your head. There's some frowning and some sighing and some, even though I can't hear you, I can hear it in my mind, the sort of shrug of the shoulders and the sigh. Why are you getting us to do this? I'm getting you to do this because of that particular response that we've just seen in the chat. Because most of us can't do it. And I'm relieved that an audience of accountants can't do it either. Why am I getting you to do this? I'm getting you to do this for a few reasons. And I've given myself a blank screen so that we're not distracted from it, because I think this is really important. We think about working memory as being a sort of, a toast rack with 7 slices in it where we can put pieces of information. Those pieces of information can be facts, but they can also be calculations and processes as well. And the size of that calculational process is still fundamentally affected by how much is in our long-term memory, how much we already know about it. When I ask you to do 9 times 9, you can do it straight away. If I asked you to do 12 times 12, you would straight away say 144. When I ask you to do 17 times 17, there's a pause and there's some disagreement. From a mathematical perspective, the difference between 12 times 12 and 17 times 17 is virtually nothing in terms of the mathematical complexity of it. It's the same level of complexity. And yet, because you've learned your 12 times table, and most of us have never done the 17 times table, we can't do 17 times 17 instantly. And what we do instead, and I'm guessing many of you would have done this, is you've taken one of the 17s and you've smashed it into 2, into a 10 and a 7. And you've done the same with the other 17, and you've taken one of the 10s and multiplied it by the 7 and by the other 10, and then done the same with the other 7. And you can just about hold together, having broken it into 10s and 7s, done those different calculations, and then assembled them in together into the answer. We've just about got enough capacity in working memory to be able to do that. But once we make it even bigger and we do 621 times 247, that capacity is exceeded. Now, this example illustrates the fact that it's not just facts, it's calculations, it's complex things that we retrieve into our working memory that have been stored in our long-term memory. And it also, I think, illustrates in a way the power of rote learning. Now, rote learning is often decried as the devil in higher education and in any level of education. It's something that we shouldn't be encouraging people to do. And there is good reason why we shouldn't be encouraging people to do that. And yet, when it comes to learning very basic facts from a position of absolutely no knowledge, it is often a really good way to get started, because you need those basic facts before you can even do even something very basic with that information. Okay, so let's take that and spend just a few seconds trying to explain what higher order learning is, and then take that back to ChatGPT and academic integrity. There's a lot of talk in higher education circles, and we've heard some of it already today about what higher order learning is. Turns out it's quite difficult to pin that down. We know what it is when we see it, we think, but defining it is quite hard to do. We've synthesized some of the literature on this, and higher order learning is often defined as not being lower order learning, not being factual recall. We know what lower order learning is. It's recall and comprehension without application. Higher order questions, higher order learning tends to be learning that uses prior knowledge, that applies new information, identifies relationships between information, and asks us to analyze, synthesize, or evaluate information. And often the way that we conceptualize or we visualize the distinction between those two things is using tools like Bloom's taxonomy. Now, Bloom's taxonomy has had a bit of a kicking over the years, and rightly so. It's the basis for it is quite flawed in a number of ways. But as a practical tool, it does hold up in terms of being a tool by which we might to write learning outcomes, starting with asking students to be able to list things, recall things, define things, and we progress to the point where we're asking students to rate, evaluate, assess, or judge things. Another way that we think about the distinction between lower order and higher order, this is more commonly used in medical education, is this idea of what we call Miller's pyramid. When you're teaching students, particularly to do a practical skill, you might ask them, you might first assess them and get them to demonstrate that they know something, and then that they know how, and eventually get them to a point where they're actually doing it. Now, why are we talking about this? Why are we have we spent all this these 10 or 15, 20 minutes trying to distinguish between our ability to explain how and why we learn and what working memory is and why it's important, and factual knowledge versus higher order learning? One of the key things that I think is getting lost in our discussions of academic integrity, and particularly ChatGPT, is the fundamental importance of foundational knowledge. We cannot do critical appraisal if we don't know the basic facts of something. Right? And this is something that cognitive psychologists, in particular Daniel Willingham, whose work I've cited here, have been talking about for a very long time in response to the idea that we don't need to teach facts because we can just Google something. We cannot do critical appraisal unless we know the facts. And if I show you a list of fundamental core knowledge from neuroscience, which is my field, right? These are all regions of the brain that medical students have to know. But really by the end of the first or second year, they have to know where these regions of the brain are. They have to be able to point at them on a specimen of the brain. They have to know what happens when these regions go wrong, what their function is, how they work together, and diseases where they're problematic, and so on. Now, when I see this list, this is what I'm seeing. All right, this is just a list of towns and cities in England to me. This is my second language. I know what all these things are. I know where they are. I know what happens when they go wrong. I'm going to guess that seeing this list for you from an accountancy perspective, it's just like seeing a list of towns and cities in Myanmar. Right? It's nonsensical. It's a list of abstract words. There's nothing in here that allows you even any basic sense of what these things are or where they are, apart from perhaps the idea of midbrain maybe being in the middle, substantia nigra being black substance, what they are, where they are, what they do, etc. Without having the basic foundational knowledge and the core facts, you can't do anything with this. If we flip that on its head, if we look at foundational knowledge in management accountancy, this is a list of 10 foundational principles for management accountancy that I asked ChatGPT to give me last night. So I can't tell you whether these are right or wrong, and I can't tell you what half of these are, except that I'm reassured that ethics and professional standards is there because we spent a bit of time talking about it at lunchtime. Cost, volume, profit analysis, I haven't got a clue what that means. That is towns and cities in Myanmar to me. That's without having even a basic knowledge of what those words mean, I can't do anything with that. And if I give you an applied example of this, we go back to our example from the United States medical licensing exam. In this scenario here, you've got the first few lines are a description of the boy's situation as provided by his mother. What this scenario then describes, though, is what the results are when the medical student examines that patient, i.e. takes that patient in front of them and then looks for certain things. Knowing what to look for is core foundational knowledge. Unless you have the basic facts about what the words in the scenario mean, you won't know what to look for. And then the results of the exam that the doctor does on the patient contain these technical terms that, again, unless you know what they mean, are absolutely helpless. So maybe you know what dentition is, acetaminophen is American for paracetamol, gingivae, palpation, ecmoses, scalp erythematous, etc. My point of showing you this is ChatGPT can answer this question, but unless you've got the basic foundational knowledge, you won't know what to ask ChatGPT in order for it to be able to answer this question. That 6-year-old boy presents itself to a webcam connected to ChatGPT. ChatGPT won't be able to diagnose what's wrong. ChatGPT won't know to ask for more information about the diet. And the fact that the doctor knows how to do this is because of the fundamental importance of foundational core knowledge. Now, that's an example from medicine. I've used the example from medicine because it's easy for me to explain with medicine, but as some of the literature I referred to earlier has shown, this principle applies for almost anything that we're trying to learn. Okay, so how do we assess foundational knowledge then? We assess foundational knowledge, or a really good way to assess foundational knowledge is using multiple choice questions. And here is where we move on for the last few minutes or so on to how to write effective multiple choice questions. Now, the standard multiple choice question is a single best answer question. And I'm just going to spend a few moments giving some very basic suggestions about how to do this, because the literature suggests that as educators, we don't do a very good job of this, even though some of the things I'm going to tell you will seem blindingly obvious. There's a literature in school education around what's called assessment literacy for teachers. The teachers know how to write a good assessment. They know what reliability, validity, and authenticity are. And the literature from higher education is that we don't know an awful lot about that. In fact, there's almost no literature on assessment literacy in higher education. So I think it's worth us spending some time giving ourselves the skills to become assessment literate in general, because it's a good thing to do, but knowing what a good assessment is will help us with some of these challenges with ChatGPT, etc. as well. So a good MCQ is normally, or the most common way that we think about it is single best answer, SBA. That involves having a single answer that is the best answer. It doesn't mean having only one correct answer. It has meaning having an answer that is on balance most likely to be correct compared to the other options. Let me give you a really simple example, hopefully one that we can all relate to now because we've just spent 50 minutes or so covering it. This would be an example of very typical standard factual, so low-level foundational knowledge MCQ about the different types of memory, which type of memory has a limited capacity of around 7 chunks. And hopefully you would know on the basis of what we've done that the answer is working memory answer option E. The anatomy of an MCQ is quite important for what's going to come in a few minutes' time. The question itself is there. The answer options is there. The literature might talk about these as distractors, with answer option E being the correct answer and the others being the distractor options. In order to make an MCQ effective, there are some very basic things that we commonly get wrong that we must not lose sight of. And having done some work with Joan and Sarah on exams in accountancy and done this in other fields as well, even these basic things are things that I find we get quite wrong in MCQs from all sorts of different fields. So for example, here's an MCQ about working memory. Who worked with Graham Hitch to develop a model of working memory? And then there's various variations on the spelling of the word Alan Baddeley. This doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the chap's name is or how to spell it. This is an irrelevant and trivial multiple choice question, and yet you'd be surprised how commonly we see this as what the literature calls an item writing flaw, a multiple choice question that assesses something that just isn't relevant, in part because we just need a certain number of questions, and so we write things that are irrelevant. Here's a different example. Now you can see a couple of the answer options are different. We've got cardiovascular disease and dementia. These are what the literature would call heterogeneous answer options. Okay, so this is perhaps easier to grasp if you are a life scientist or a medical or a neuroscientist. Whereas before we had 5 different memory types, now we've got 3 memory types and 2 diseases. So the answer options are now heterogeneous. If we can't think of 5 answer options, it's better just to use 3 plausible answer options. What we also find then is that people, instead, if they can't think of 5 answer options, they'll put in joke answer options or novelty answer options, Elvis Presley or the Severn Bridge or something like that. I've seen this in professional licensing exams from a number of disciplines. If we can't think of 5 answer options or 4 answer options, it's okay just to have 3, as long as the answer options are all plausible so that we can pick the single best. It's clear that Severn Bridge and Cader Idris are not types of memory. So it's not only are they, is it not worth putting them in, they actually make the question difficult from more difficult in a way that is not making the desired learning more difficult to assess. They're just making it a pain in the bum, basically. And there's a huge amount written about the basics of how to write good single best answer questions. And there's a summary here from the medical education literature, which just covers some of the things we've just covered. Along with some basic recommendations to check grammar and punctuation, make sure that they're appropriately difficult. We're often advised to put the answer options in alphabetical order, and so on. The final thing we'll talk about then is what we were originally going to talk about before ChatGPT came along, but which is still really important, is whether we can use multiple choice questions to assess higher order learning. So in addition to those basic features that I just showed you, what are the features of a multiple choice question that assesses higher order learning? Before we get into that, I'm just going to spend one slide explaining why I think this is important. And I know this again was something that came up in the earlier parts of the discussion about whether essays are dead and moribund and defunct. And honestly, I think that they are. I think they have been for a long time. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I should be clear that I'm talking here about essays as asynchronous coursework, where we give students an essay task and they go away and come back 3-4 weeks later and they've completed it. Essays have always been an unreliable form of assessment. And here reliability means the likelihood that if the 2 different trained markers were to mark the essay, they would give the same mark. Or that if you gave the student the same essay topic twice, that they would get the same mark, even if they wrote a broadly similar essay. Essays are very unreliable from that perspective. Essays are a lot of work to mark. This is something that Martin Compton alluded to. We worry a lot about replacing essays with things like oral presentations because of the workload associated with them, and I think that is a legitimate concern, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that setting and marking essays is also a huge amount of work as well. They're very rarely authentic unless we really want to train our students to do academic writing, which is a legitimate thing that we want certain students to be able to do, but we often use essays as a proxy for something else. And if we're going to use essays as a proxy, then there are other proxies that we can use, and hopefully I can persuade you that MCQs are one of those. Essays generally tend to be narrow and deep, which can be a good thing to do, but means we generally cover only a limited amount of the curriculum where we're extensively using essays. And the main reason why I wanted to move away from essays is because they are so vulnerable to academic misconduct. We haven't even really talked today about plagiarism, old-fashioned plagiarism. It is extremely common, intentional or unintentional. Students will copy, paste, and paraphrase in a way that often does not reflect their own understanding and their own academic writing, but a rephrasing of somebody else's. Contract cheating, as in the first and second presentations showed, it's not very common, but it's more common than we might hope, and it does make academic writing very easy. And then, of course, ChatGPT is incredibly good at academic writing, and as I said earlier, I should have been confident that I was going to say this because I've prompted it into the slides. It's going to be built into word processing tools, so it's going to be so easy for students to use ChatGPT, and they're probably not even going to realize that they're using it. So, can MCQs fill some of this gap? Can MCQs replace essays? MCQs are vulnerable to many of those same challenges, but they have many benefits besides. One common complaint is that MCQs are only good at assessing factual learning, and apologies for the terrible PowerPoint animation, but I wanted to illustrate the point that there are lots and lots and lots of papers written which are absolutely clear that MCQs can assess higher order learning as defined in the way that I did a few slides ago. This is something that that is long established and is one of those things that once you start looking, you see it everywhere. The ability of MCQs to effectively assess higher order learning. The challenge then becomes A, persuading people that it's the case, and B, giving them the guidance about how to do it. And that's what we're going to spend the last few minutes doing. I spent a lot of time reading all those papers and looking for common pieces of advice within them, because I think the best way to get people to be able to do this, to capture some of the benefits of MCQs, the lower workload, the broader curriculum coverage, the objectivity, the reliability, is to give them the tools to be able to write MCQs in a way that assesses higher order learning. I am a pragmatist at heart. If you make things easy for people, then they're more likely to do it. So I read all those papers and I wrote some guidance. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through that guidance, show you some examples, and I'm going to leave you with a question from an ACCA, I believe that's the correct acronym, exam that I believe assesses lower order learning, and then give you the chance if you want to try and reframe it into a question that assesses higher order learning. So the guidance that we come up with then is as follows. The easiest way to write a higher order MCQ is to start with a lower order MCQ. We find it quite easy to write an MCQ that assesses factual knowledge. Then take that MCQ and add a problem scenario to it. And one way to do that is simply to write a description of the fact and the situation within that MCQ using common language. Absolutely critical then to making that MCQ assess higher order learning is to identify what the literature calls assumed knowledge. This is knowledge that the test taker, your student, has to have in order to be able to answer the question, but that assumed knowledge is not in the questions itself and is not in any of the answer options. You think about it as a bridge between those two things. And once you've identified that assumed knowledge, then you're really in a good shape for making a multiple choice question assess higher order learning. Writing your MCQs in common language makes it more likely that the MCQ will assess higher order learning, because the student then has to translate that into the language of the discipline and then back again. Having the answer options be active, and I'll show you some examples of what that means, but rather than simple list of facts, the answer options be a list of something that students might do. And then something we won't talk about simply for the interest of time is to use annotated images as part of the question stem. And I'll just leave that there in the guidance, but as I said, we won't talk about it. And then increasing the number of answer options is the final recommendation that comes up in this literature about how to make MCQs assess higher order learning. So I'm going to talk you through an example, and then I'll leave you with the opportunity to work through one on your own. So here is a very simple, fact-based, lower order, if you like, MCQ. Which of the following is an ineffective teaching strategy? This is also a Trojan horse for me to be able to tell you that learning styles doesn't work as a teaching strategy, even though we are always told that it does. So learning styles is the correct answer here, right? And you've got 5 different teaching methods of learning and teaching. We've got the question, we've got the options. The first thing we want to do then, if we're going to follow the guidance, is to add a problem scenario to this. So to describe in common language the situation into which this question might apply. So here then is a problem situation. Calmus is a student studying climate change. Calmus is struggling with the topic and asked the instructor to suggest some effective study strategies to help me learn about climate change. And then the question becomes, which of the following would be the least effective? And again, apologies for putting huge amounts of text onto the slide, but learning and teaching is complicated sometimes. Here then now are 8 answer options. And the answer options are in plain language and they are active. Okay, so if I talk you through the other aspects of the guidance then. Active answers then rather than statements of fact. So here we have for each of the study strategies, they're all as illustrated by the word at the beginning of the sentence, actions. So breaking study into short blocks of related topics, finding real world context, forming a study peer group. They're not simple statements of learning and teaching methods. They're also written in plain language, apart from the occasional piece of technical term like VARC learning style. Other examples of active answers, very relevant for the accountancy literature based upon the exams that I've seen. Getting students to do a calculation is an active answer. It's not a simple fact. The student's got to do something with the information that you've given from them that automatically elevates the cognitive level of the exam, of the question. Asking them for an action, what would you do next? Find something, where is X relative to Y, something that we might use in anatomy, for example. Or simply describing an action. Here, list of answer options might be something increases, something decreases. The participants in this scenario might buy something, they might sell something, they might go and see a certain person, they might all be active. Simplest way to get experience with this is to have a go. Assumed knowledge. This is perhaps the most important part of making your MCQ higher order, is to identify that cognitive bridge between the answers in the scenario. Now, the example that I gave you, it's not perhaps the best example of assumed knowledge, but I'll talk you through where the assumed knowledge lives and what it is and how you might use that as a way of generating assumed knowledge for other questions. So what you have here for each of the answer options is a description of an action in mostly plain language. Now, the assumed knowledge is the technical name for what each of these things represents. Right, so if I show you what those technical names are, space practice, concrete examples, elaboration, mnemonics, these are technical terms from the literature around learning, teaching, and assessment. And in order to answer the question, the student has to be able to take that plain language statement in this answer option and has to be able to match that to their prior knowledge, their own existing knowledge of what that represents in terms of the technical definitions of different approaches to learning and teaching, and then identify which of those doesn't work. All right, so the technical terms here, and that is often an easy-ish way to identify assumed knowledge, is to take technical terms, rewrite them in plain language, and then the technical terms themselves then become the assumed knowledge that the student has to have. As I said earlier, the assumed knowledge should be relevant to the question and the answer. And another way to do it is to you want the student to solve a problem. So you give them a calculation to do, or some other problem to solve. A problem scenario, and then the answers are a list of answers to the problem. There are some steps that they need to take to get from one to the other. You take out the ones from the middle from the problem scenario and the answer options, and that then becomes your assumed knowledge. Easier probably though is to use technical terms and definitions as the assumed knowledge. Okay, how are we doing for time? Not too bad. All right, so I'm going to give you a summary, and then I think I'll take some questions, and I'll leave you with an example and that list of those actions, and then see if you want to have a go at turning a question to a higher order question. So key things that I hoped I was able to get across the session this afternoon: foundational knowledge is really important. And I was relieved, it's not often you say this, but I was relieved to see a government position paper on ChatGPT very recently, which said foundational knowledge is important. We can't chuck facts and foundational knowledge in the bin just because students can answer such questions using ChatGPT, because they won't know what to put into ChatGPT in the real world. Asynchronous and unproctored assignments are vulnerable to misconduct because they make it easy for students for human beings to cheat, and they give an incentive for them to do so, and human nature is such that we will do that. MCQs can assess higher order learning, and hopefully I've given you some guidance about how to do that. Here are some of the references that we've used in the presentation. I've realized now I can see that the Dan Willingham reference isn't here, so I'll add that to the version of the slides before it gets circulated. If you've got any questions about anything that we've covered and you haven't got time to ask right now, please do feel free to send me an email. I do also have a YouTube channel with a longer video about retrieval practice and about working memory and cognitive load theory, which is an approach to learning and teaching, which attempts to account for some of the limitations of human working memory. And with that, I'll put up a question for you, which I've taken from an ACCA exam, and I will put in the chat a file if I can find the way to do that, which has the guidance about how to rewrite higher order MCQs. And then I'll leave you how to think about that. And of course, we probably don't have time to write some questions ourselves and then come back. So I'll leave you with that thought, and then I'll stop sharing and then see if anyone has got any questions or thoughts about what we've covered. Everyone's cognitively overloaded. Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I've never denied that that setting application questions in MCQs is possible, but I would tend to set the. I know theory might say differently, but if you set the higher order thinking band above application, and I know Bloom is rough and ready, it is much more difficult to do, is it not?
You mean it's much more difficult to write the questions, or it's much more difficult for students to answer them? To
write the questions. I mean, application ones are relatively simple, particularly in our area. Calculations would be very common, for example.
Yes, that is something I probably should have said, isn't it? It's not easy to do. And one of my great hopes was that by getting MCQs to assess higher order learning, we would save on some of the workload associated with marking essays. And we do to an extent, but it takes a long time to write those questions. Once they're written, though, it is easier to repurpose them, plagiarize yourself if you like, to use them for future assessments, put them into a bank that you can reuse. And yes, I can see there's a question about whether ChatGPT can help with writing MCQs. I've asked it to do that. I've asked it how to do that as well, and it reassuringly told me many of the things that I had already found from literature. And it can be a useful tool, but I don't think there's any other way of doing it other than spending the time to do it. And then the more that you do it, the easier it gets. And what we do in medicine is we will offer faculty development sessions where the only activity is a workshop designed aimed at writing these questions, sharing strategies for doing it, and then banking the questions that we've got for use in future assessments. So it's my long-winded way of saying, yes, it is hard, but it does get easier with practice, and I think that is still worthwhile.
I don't deny it could be worthwhile if you could rely on people writing the questions reasonably well. And my experience looking at MCQs as an external examiner or even an internal assessor is that most of our colleagues haven't a clue how to write decent MCQs, even after they've been through a workshop saying things not dissimilar to what you've said.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the contrast, I think, as a pragmatist, the contrast for me is with essays. Writing a good essay question can also be very difficult, and in terms of what you're getting students to do, because essays are so fundamentally limited, especially now because of all these tools we've got, we're caught in a way between a rock and a hard place, and that it's a choice between setting higher order MCQs and recognizing that that's difficult to do, or doing an assessment that in many ways is possibly just not valid because of the many challenges we have. It's not a binary situation, clearly, I
think the only way to compare the two is by assuming that they're both being done in a closed exam format.
Yes.
Because MCQs done in a non-closed format, you can often find the questions and the answers. Certainly in our discipline, I know there's a survey, a piece of research which has done that and found that nearly all the answers to all the questions that they looked at were available on the web to the actual questions, not to it's not an intelligent answering system, and it's assuming you keep your questions secure, i.e. they don't leak into the world, which they do. Can people remember them and catalog them and post them on student sites with the answers? And people then just memorize the answers, which is not then testing what you think it's testing. It's testing recall of a vast number of MCQ answers.
So I think that is an area where, having banked the questions, you can, and particularly where you're asking students to do calculations, you can quite easily mitigate some of the challenges of sites like Chegg and I've got to get the names right or else I get in trouble. Don't use the name then so you don't get in trouble. There are sites where students post exam questions that they've taken screenshots of and so on, and then students, as you say, they can memorize the answers. If you're asking students to do a calculation, a slight tweak of the input numbers and the answer options.
Yeah, I agree with numbers that are relatively easily dealt with. Most of our high level issues are not numbers, they're interpretation of numbers.
Yeah.
And that is, yeah, and I mean, I'll be honest, I've given up with MCQs entirely because I've tried to ban them in my institution and almost managed it. In the business school, at least within accounting and finance anyway, because empirically they were dreadful. Average grades of 90, 95. One test had an average of 99%. Correct. And you know that people are therefore not doing them properly. So I do think the pragmatic answer you're giving isn't taking into account the real situation, and you're thinking of some false idea of reliability in sense of test reliability compared with relevance. Really, what's relevant for you to be testing?
So I think,
it's very easy to have a reliable test, but it doesn't mean that it's relevant to what you're trying to test.
So I think making sure the assessment is valid is clearly the most important thing. You can have a reliable assessment that's not valid, but you can't have a valid assessment that's not reliable. And I think that's the pushback onto that. I think the fact that people don't write good MCQs and don't know how to write good MCQs, training or otherwise, to me is not a reason to ban them or to say that they're not a good assessment. It's just that people aren't doing them well in the same way as they wouldn't be using any other tool particularly well. And again, I think the contrast with other forms of assessment is illustrative. A good MCQ is a good form of assessment. It's not a perfect form of assessment. It's not the only sort of assessment we can do, but it is still a really good assessment if it's done properly. And I think the limitations of MCQs need to be stacked up against the limitations of other assessment formats, which in the era of ChatGPT and contract cheating are fundamental and profound. And the fact that we don't know how to set a good assessment, it's not our academics' fault. It's in many ways, it's not even our university's fault, given the way that the business model works in UK higher education. But I don't think that should be the excuse for not doing good assessments properly, is that people aren't trained how to do it.
I mean, I feel like I'm dominating this, but nobody else is putting their hand up. But do you think you can really set MCQs that judge those higher levels of Bloom's, judgment and synthesis?
Yes, definitely. And I would say in medicine, we do that all the time. At every level, even as someone who wants to go from being a senior doctor to a very senior doctor to become a consultant cannot do that without answering banks of higher order multiple choice questions. It isn't the only thing they do, clearly, but it is an assessment at a very high level of Bloom's because they solve a problem with a subjective but yet single best answer. And that's perhaps in part why I am still so enthusiastic about the fact that we can do this in other disciplines, because it is done all the time in medicine, which in many ways is one of the most complex and challenging disciplines in terms of problem solving and higher order at a higher order. So if we can do it there, I think we can do it anywhere. I mean,
the reason I would question that is because you're still assuming there is a single best answer. And in many cases in social science, there is no single best answer, because the best answer depends on the perspective you're coming from, and that we do not necessarily have universal agreement on what that is.
And in that case, then an MCQ might not necessarily be the best assessment. the best assessment format. I'm by no means advocating for them as the sole assessment format. What I'm advocating for them for is increase their use, and to say that they can clearly assess higher order learning. And that's not research that I've done. There's an abundance of evidence to show that. Let's go back to a point that you made earlier on. Yes, I do think we have to assess under closed book conditions, and I probably didn't explain this in great detail, in part because it's very depressing, but the original intention of this project was that if we write, using the guidance that we developed for how to write higher order MCQs, can we then use those sorts of questions in open book exams, because students won't be able to simply Google the answer? And we ran some experiments, and we showed clearly that it was the case. Students with no subject knowledge could Google the answers to the lower order questions and get them all done very well, but they could not solve the problems that we'd pose in the higher order format. And we literally submitted the paper, and then ChatGPT came along, and ChatGPT could solve the problems. And so any open book assessment where ChatGPT is available, the higher order questions will be invalid, as will pretty much any form of assessment unless it's done in person, I think.
Well, I think, sorry to interject, because we have to move on. Jenny wants to ask the question, but just before I do that, I think, Phil, that what you've explained today is certainly a lot better than what we're currently doing in accounting, quite frankly. And most of us in accounting do not know how to write MCQs in the way that you're talking about. So they're not the best, they're not necessarily the only method of assessment. I agree with you, Greg, but this is better than I think what we could do is learn from this field. We can learn more and apply it in our own field. Jenny, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm quite excited about using MCQs, and I've never seen this kind of idea that you take a lower order one and then you zhuzh it up. So I think it's really interesting to see that, and I'm really excited about it. And I just wondered how you zhuzh up a question to try and test students being able to explain things.
So you want the student to be able to explain something to you? Yeah,
explain a viewpoint. So how have you come to this conclusion? Or do you think we should stick with other kinds of questions to test that? Because it's really important that, because there might be many different answers to a question, it's really important that students can state a viewpoint and then justify it. And I wondered if you had any bright ideas, given your experience with multiple choice questions, as to how you could put that into a multiple choice question. I'm a bit stumped.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, it's not you're not going to be able to do everything with these sorts of multiple choice questions, but we can do a lot, I think. And asking students, giving them a list of options, which are justifications, which are explanations, which are all plausible to an extent, but for which one is clearly the one that you want them to get to, is perhaps one way of doing it. Giving them a list of opinions or a list of explanations and saying which one best fits the justification for this. That would be one way to do it, I think. I
suppose you could have multiple answers and more than one of them are correct, because I really want to get my students away from thinking there is only one answer and you have to think the same way as me. I want them to think there's multiple different ways to answer a question. So I suppose you could say select the best single answer, and then the correct answer is A or B. You get a mark for both.
Yes, so the medical education lot, they're quite snooty about this for reasons I've never been able to fully drill down into. And I took this out of my guidance that said you shouldn't have answer combinations. So is it A, B, C, D, or A and B, or C and D? I don't see why we can't do that necessarily. And there are more complex ways of developing multiple choice questions that we didn't have time to get into. So one way that we've looked at is you give students a list of answer options and you say, don't pick the single best answer, but just eliminate all the ones that are incorrect. And that then takes you in a position of getting 1 mark per question to potentially getting 4 marks per question. If there's only one correct answer, a student only knows that 2 of them are wrong, but not quite sure about some of the others, maybe they get 2 marks instead of 5. That adds a level of granularity and complexity very simplistically in a way that most learning management systems can do, for example. And then extended matching questions and other forms of MCQ, which are a little bit more sophisticated, and students probably need a bit of practice to be able to do, but still allow you to do some of this higher order assessment in a way that's a bit more reliable and objective than some of the other ways that we might traditionally do it.
Yeah.
Whether, Jenny, you could, if it's got to be all MCQ, or whether you could, for the last few questions, do an MCQ start, and they select A, and you then have a written box which says justify your answer.
Yeah.
And you could then, I know you've still got some marking to do on that, but it might allow the students to then justify the reasoning behind what they've done, and you mark that part of the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a thought, but.
And you can make the justification part multiple choice as well. So you can have multiple stage questions where they pick a correct answer and then they're given a list of options as to why that's correct. And then they pick one of those, for example.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. Well, Phil, thank you very much. I thought it was very exciting to understand a bit more about how the brain works. Because I've never really thought about it like that, but you've demonstrated to me that my memory's pretty rubbish. And
All of our memory is rubbish. Don't worry, John, please.
Well, I shouldn't be expecting students to be good at it either. So, we all make assumptions about what our students can recall fairly quickly. So it's crazy. And I will be thinking about looking at some of those papers you sent or you talked about, and we will distribute the slides to everybody because I think that's really good. There's a few things in the chat. Emma, you've talked about Canvas has a great quiz function. You've put in a graph there. Moodle also, somebody's mentioned, provides this as well. So there are various pieces of software that can help us do this. So I think that there probably is lots more to talk about. Maybe we should have a whole session about assessment again in the not too distant future to look at some of these issues in a bit more detail. So thank you very much, Phil. So the last thing we need to do, and we're just conscious that we don't want people disappearing out of the room because we need a certain number of people in the room to vote. The last thing we need to do now, we need to